Hello and welcome to this video lecture which is going to be looking at the historical and cultural context of person-centered theory. This lecture is the first in a series of 4 lectures where I'll be covering different aspects. As I just mentioned, this first lecture will cover the historical and cultural development of person-centered theory, looking at where did the ideas and the principles of person-centered theory come from. The second lecture will give an overview of the theory, a brief summary, if you like, of what Carl Rogers thought about human behaviour and why humans had particular problems. In the third lecture we'll look at some examples, some video examples of people be interacting with each other in ways that are examples of person-centered theory in action. And then in the fourth lecture I'm going to be using an example from my personal narrative, my personal life story, to show some of the complexities of applying the theory against the reality that we sometimes face. The difference, if you like, between person-centered values in theory and as they're actually practiced. So if we look at the context in which person-centered theory developed, and if we put it in a particular time, in a particular place, person-centered theory was developed in North America and to some extent in Western Europe in the mid-20th century. Now, if we look at that time, that was a time when there were strong social forces. There was forces of social conservatism and conformity. It was an era when people obeyed and followed fairly strict social rules. Class was still a very significant factor, and so was religion. So these played a very big part in society. So when we looked at the issue of religion, we can see, for example, the way that religious norms about behaviour, particularly around issues of sex and sexuality, these led to various kind of emphasis on proper behaviour, which in turn generated concerns and feelings of shame and of guilt. And this was against, this isn't particularly just because of religion, this is because of that wider context. There's a lot of fear driving people's conformity, whether that was the McCarthy witch hunts against communists, or campaigns against sexual diseases, or just general fears of young people and of rebellion, and all these were applying a strong force on people to conform. At the same time, there were other forces developing which shaped people's views of human nature from the areas of psychology. So we see in that mid-20th century period a growing strength and influence of psychodynamic theories, and we can even see this entering popular culture. So if you look at the films of that mid-20th century, of the 1950s, 60s, you can see things like the influence in The Forbidden Planet, where you see Freudian concepts, psychodynamic concepts being applied to science fiction. So in this movie there's this thing of monsters from the id, drawing very much on psychodynamic theory. And even in sort of very light-hearted comedy movies like Pillow Talk with Rock Hudson and Doris Day, again you can see this casual references to people having an analyst. So the strength of the idea drawn from the work of Sigmund Freud, who was the originator of psychodynamic theory. And he really saw humans as being driven by these instinctual, selfish drives, the sex drive and the drive to dominate others, and he saw these as being fundamental to human nature, and to some extent these needing to be tamed in order for society to exist, but for there to be this tension between drives that needed to be expressed but also drives that needed to be held in check. And he understood that this was what would cause problems, and it was only through the work of a properly trained and experienced psychoanalyst that would be able to help people manage and overcome the difficulties they had through these drives. So that was one psychological theory. A different psychological theory came from behavioral theories, and in particular from the work of B.F. Skinner. As you can see from this picture here, B.F. Skinner worked a lot with animals, so here he's working with pigeons. He also worked with rats, and he developed something called a Skinner box, which is a way of testing the way that animals could be taught to behave in particular ways. And so for behavioral theories, human behavior was not really because of instinctive drives. We had a few very primitive instinctive drives, but nothing major. But Skinner believed that the whole thing came down to rewards, so that if we were rewarded for behaving in certain ways, we would be more likely to behave in that way. And so Skinner believed that behavioral psychologists could essentially get people to behave in a particular way. What all these had in common is the idea that there was somebody, whether it was a priest or a psychoanalyst or a behavioral therapist, who could essentially fix your behavior. So it really didn't matter which of these traditions you came from. They were all essentially telling you there was something wrong with you, and that an expert would fix it for you. And this was very much the context in which Carl Rogers began to practice. Carl Rogers himself came from a very religious background, which to some extent he reacted against. He was trained as a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, in a post-Freudian way through one of the followers of Freud. But he reacted against that because he believed that it wasn't about an expert who would tell you what was wrong with you. It was about people's ability to fix themselves. And so he wasn't into behaviorism either, into the idea that we could reward people for behaving in certain ways. He believed that these social forces were pushing people into conforming to someone else's standards instead of being free to really be themselves. So those kind of very social conservatist and conformist pressures, these were the things that Rogers was reacting against. And if you understand that, you can understand a little more about the importance of person-centered theory as a model for social change and for different relationships in society. So I hope that's been a useful introduction for you, and in the next video I'm going to be looking at an overview of the model.